Picture this: a skinny, lisping kid in Brooklyn, glasses too big for his face, getting his pigeons killed by neighborhood bullies who then punch him in the mouth for crying about it. Nobody in that moment, not the bullies, not the kid himself, not a single soul on that grimy Brownsville street, could have imagined that this same boy would grow up to become the most feared man on the planet, the youngest heavyweight champion in history, a living legend whose name alone could empty a room or fill a stadium. This is the story of Mike Tyson, and it's not just a boxing story. It's a story about how the worst beginnings can somehow forge the most unforgettable lives. Let's go back. Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the 1970s wasn't just a rough neighborhood. It was one of the most dangerous zip codes in America. Poverty wasn't a phase. It was the air people breathed. Michael Gerard Tyson was born there on June 30th, 1966, into a home already cracking apart. His mother, Lorna Smith, raised him and his siblings largely on her own, and the family moved constantly, chasing stability that never quite arrived. There was no father in any steady sense. There was barely enough food some nights. What there was, in abundance, was violence. On the streets, in the apartment hallways, in the quiet resignation of a neighborhood that had stopped expecting anything better. Young Mike was an unlikely candidate for toughness. He was overweight, soft-spoken, and he had a lisp that made him a target the second he opened his mouth. Kids mocked him mercilessly. And here's the detail that almost nobody expects. Tyson's first real love wasn't fighting. It was pigeons. He kept them on rooftops, cared for them like they were the only pure thing in his world. And when a local bully snapped the neck of one of his birds just to hurt him, something in that boy broke, and something else was born. He beat that older kid badly. And for the first time in his life, Mike Tyson felt what power tasted like. He felt seen. That taste turned into a habit. By the time he was a preteen, Tyson had already been arrested dozens of times. Some accounts say as many as 38 arrests before he even hit puberty. Robbery, mugging, petty theft, always circling back to the same instinct. Hit first, hit hard, survive. Brownsville doesn't hand out second chances easily, and by 12 years old, Mike Tyson had been sent to the Tryon School for Boys, a juvenile detention facility in upstate New York. To most people watching from the outside, this looked like the beginning of the end for a kid nobody would remember. Instead, it was the beginning of everything. Inside Tryon, a counselor named Bobby Stewart, himself a former boxer, noticed something in Tyson that nobody else had bothered to look for. Not just raw aggression, but a fire, a hunger, an almost frightening natural gift. Stewart started training him, and once he felt Tyson was ready, he did something that would alter the entire trajectory of American sports history. He introduced this troubled, violent teenager to a legendary old trainer named Cus D'Amato. Cus D'Amato was already a boxing institution by then, the man who had trained champions like Floyd Patterson and Jose Torres. He was in his 70s, living in a big old house in Catskill, New York, running a modest gym, and more importantly, taking in troubled young fighters who had nowhere else to go. When Tyson first sparred in front of him, D'Amato reportedly turned to the people around him and said this kid, if handled right, could be the heavyweight champion of the world. Not maybe, not someday. He said it like a fact already written in stone. D'Amato didn't just see a puncher. He saw a wounded, frightened boy hiding behind a wall of violence, and he made a decision that would define the rest of Tyson's life. He took him in. Literally. Tyson moved into D'Amato's home. For the first time, he had a stable bed, regular meals, and something he had never experienced before. A father figure who believed in him unconditionally. D'Amato didn't just teach him the peekaboo style, the bobbing, the head movement, the terrifying speed-power combination that would later demolish opponents in seconds. He rebuilt Tyson's entire psychology. He taught him that fear was not the enemy. Fear was fuel, something to be controlled and weaponized rather than avoided. He drilled into Tyson, day after day, that he was destined for something enormous, until the boy from Brownsville actually started to believe it. But life, as it so often does, had a cruel sense of timing. In 1985, Just as 18-year-old Tyson was on the very edge of turning pro, Cus D'Amato died. The one man who had rescued him from a life of prison and violence was suddenly gone. Tyson has spoken openly over the years about how devastating this loss was, how he felt unmoored, terrified of failing the man who believed in him more than anyone ever had. Grief could have derailed him completely. Instead, it lit something under him. Tyson threw himself into boxing with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, almost as if every punch was a tribute, a desperate attempt to prove that D'Amato hadn't wasted his faith on a lost cause. The results were almost unbelievable. Tyson turned pro in 1985 and began knocking out opponents at a pace nobody had seen in modern heavyweight boxing. Many of his early fights didn't even last one full round. He wasn't just winning, he was terrifying people before the bell even rang. Opponents would talk about the walk to the ring, watching this stone-faced, black-trunked, no-socks, no-robe fighter approach like an executioner, and feeling their legs go weak before a single punch landed. Then came November 22, 1986, Las Vegas. Tyson, 20 years old, stepped into the ring against WBC champion Trevor Berbick. It lasted less than 2 rounds. Berbick went down 3 times in the second round, his legs betraying him in a way that looked almost tragic, comic, and heartbreaking all at once. And when the referee waved it off, something historic had just happened. At 20 years and 4 months old, Mike Tyson became the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history, a record that, decades later, still stands. Think about that for a second. 20 years old. Most people at 20 are still figuring out who they are. Tyson was already the most dangerous man on earth, sitting on top of the most prestigious title in combat sports, a title held before him by legends like Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, and George Foreman. The kid who used to get beaten up over pigeons was now a global phenomenon. Over the next few years, Tyson didn't just hold the title, he unified it, becoming the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world by defeating Tony Tucker in 1987, adding the IBF belt to the WBC and WBA titles he already carried. He was unstoppable, seemingly indestructible, a wrecking ball with an 80% knockout rate that made every fight appointment television. Kids wanted to be him. Grown men were afraid of him. He was, for a stretch of years, the single most famous athlete on the planet. But fame like that doesn't come without cracks forming underneath. And Tyson's life outside the ring was beginning to spiral in ways the public was only starting to glimpse. His marriage to actress Robin Givens in 1988 became a public spectacle, filled with headlines about instability and turmoil, and it ended within the same year it began. Without Cus D'Amato's steady hand, and increasingly under the influence of promoter Don King, a man many close to Tyson believed exploited him financially and emotionally, the young champion's foundation was eroding. The mentor who had rebuilt him was gone, and the people who filled that void didn't have his best interests at heart the way D'Amato had. Then came the moment that shocked the entire sporting world. February 11, 1990, Tokyo, Japan. Tyson, heavily favored, an undefeated 37-0 wrecking machine, stepped into the ring against a 42-1 underdog named James "Buster" Douglas. Nobody gave Douglas a real chance. Tyson himself reportedly hadn't trained with his usual intensity, distracted by chaos in his personal life. And in the 10th round, the unthinkable happened. Douglas landed a combination that put Tyson on the canvas, fumbling for his mouthpiece in a daze, unable to beat the count. The most feared man in sports history was knocked out. The invincible myth shattered on live television in front of the entire world. It was one of the biggest upsets in the history of any sport, and it revealed something important. Tyson wasn't a machine. He was a human being, carrying wounds that ran far deeper than anyone realized, and the mask of invincibility could crack. Worse was still coming. In 1992, Tyson was convicted of raping 18-year-old Desiree Washington, a Miss Black America contestant, following an encounter in an Indianapolis hotel room. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison and served 3 before being released on parole in 1995. This is a permanent, undeniable part of his story, a conviction that changed public perception of him forever and remains one of the most serious and scrutinized events of his life. Tyson has always maintained his innocence, but the conviction stood, and it cost him years of his prime, his reputation, and, by his own later admission, pieces of himself he never fully got back. When he emerged from prison in 1995, the world was watching a different Tyson. Heavier, more guarded, trying to reclaim a throne that had moved on without him. He did reclaim titles for a stretch, but the fighter who returned wasn't quite the same phenomenon from the 80s. And in 1997, in a rematch against Evander Holyfield, a man who had already beaten him once, Tyson did something that would become one of the most replayed, most infamous moments in sports history. In the third round, frustrated and reportedly enraged by repeated headbutts from Holyfield, Tyson bit a chunk out of Holyfield's ear. Twice, the fight was stopped. Tyson was disqualified, fined $3 million, and had his boxing license revoked for over a year. It became an instant, permanent symbol, for better or worse, of Mike Tyson himself. Brilliant, explosive, self-destructive, all at once. The controversies didn't stop rolling in. Legal troubles, a highly publicized bankruptcy in 2003, despite earning an estimated $400 million over his career, struggles with drug addiction that he's since spoken about with striking honesty. Tyson's post-prime years read less like a sports story and more like a cautionary tale about what fame, trauma, and unresolved pain can do to even the most gifted human beings. And yet, this is where the story does something most people don't expect. It doesn't end in tragedy. It bends toward redemption. Somewhere in the wreckage of addiction, financial ruin, and public disgrace, Tyson began doing something he'd rarely had the chance to do in his chaotic life: reflect. He got sober. He rebuilt relationships, most notably with his children, after enduring the unimaginable loss of his 4-year-old daughter, Exodus, in a tragic accident in 2009. A loss he has said permanently changed him, stripping away whatever hardness remained and replacing it with a raw, aching humility. He remarried to Lakeha Kiki Spicer, and by all public accounts found a steadiness in his personal life that had eluded him for decades. Then, almost unbelievably, Tyson reinvented himself again. He appeared in mainstream films like The Hangover, poking fun at his own fearsome image. He built a one-man Broadway show, Mike Tyson, Undisputed Truth, directed by Spike Lee, where he stood on stage and told his own story: the pigeons, Cus D'Amato, the prison years, the grief, with a vulnerability nobody thought the most feared man in boxing history was capable of. He became a podcast host, an unlikely business figure in the cannabis industry, and in 2024, at 58 years old, he stepped back into a boxing ring for an exhibition against Jake Paul, drawing one of the largest audiences ever for a combat sports event. Proof that even decades later, the world still can't look away from Mike Tyson. Here's something most people don't know. Despite his terrifying public persona, Tyson has always been a devoted animal lover, especially of pigeons, the same birds that sparked his very first fight as a child. He's also an avid reader with a genuinely deep interest in history and philosophy, often citing figures like Machiavelli and Alexander the Great, a detail that surprises people who only know him from highlight reels of knockouts. And that famous face tattoo everyone recognizes? Tyson has said it was inspired by Maori warrior traditions, meant to represent strength and warrior spirit, a symbol, whether people realize it or not, of a man who has spent his entire life trying to armor himself against a world that hurt him early and hurt him often. So what do we actually do with a story like this? A man who is, undeniably, one of the greatest and most destructive forces the sport of boxing has ever seen. A man convicted of a horrific crime. A man who has caused real pain and also carried real pain, sometimes in the very same breath. Mike Tyson's story refuses to be simple, and maybe that's exactly why it still grips people, decades later. It's not a clean hero's journey. It's not a simple villain's downfall either. It's something far more human than either of those. A story about how trauma shapes us, how mentorship can save a life, how fame can just as easily destroy one, and how it's possible, even after devastating failure and real harm done, to keep searching for something like redemption. The kid who lost his pigeon and threw his first punch in grief and rage became, at 20 years old, the youngest heavyweight champion the world has ever seen. He became one of the most famous human beings alive. He fell, spectacularly and publicly, more than once. And somehow he's still here, still talking, still reflecting, still, in his own words, trying to understand himself. That, maybe, is the real legacy of Mike Tyson. Not just the knockouts or the records or the chaos, but the reminder that no life is only one thing, that the world's most feared man was also its most wounded, and that even after everything, the poverty, the violence, the prison, the grief, the public shame, a person can still keep walking forward, still keep trying to become someone better than they were. If this story moved you, if it made you see Mike Tyson as more than just a name in a highlight reel, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold true stories that go beyond the headlines, and drop a comment below telling me which part of his journey hit you the hardest. Because stories like this one, the falls, the fights, the redemption, they're not just about boxing, they're about all of us.